Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, August 11th, 2022, and today we're going to be taking a look at the governorship elections for the upcoming November elections. We are less than 90 days away today till the November midterms, and it will be very interesting to track these states over the next 3 months to see how they change over time. We've been tracking the governor elections ever since 2020, and looking at the race itself, many of them have changed in different characterizations in one direction or the other, ultimately putting Democrats and Republicans in very different positions throughout the entirety of the past 2 years. Looking at the forecast in my most recent one, which was released on July 19th, we find that amongst the matchup between Democrats and Republicans, it is 23-27, with Republicans being in the advantage. But that wasn't always the case. In different circumstances where the national environment might have looked tremendously different than it does today, Republicans were in a much higher point. Taking a look at the numbers following Glenn Youngkin's victory back in around November 2021, I actually had a map that gave Republicans 33 seats to the Democratic Party's 17. It seemed that it was almost doomed for the Democratic Party and that there was no chance that they were going to win many of these competitive seats. But ultimately, that simply did not hold. As the months progressed, Democrats got lucky with Republicans being nominated in different races that ultimately made their races less winnable and less competitive for the GOP. Looking at the trajectory and the change over time, the Democrats now stand in a much more favorable position from where they were before, but I can't say that they are the favorites to win the outright majority. But based off of population, a map such as this one being held truly, meaning that if all of these races was to go in the direction that we expect them to, Democrats would be governing the majority of the nation, even if they don't govern the majority of the states. So let's go ahead and get started by characterizing all of the states that we can characterize as safe and solid for either political party. The ratings and the characterizations and the percentages that I use to use these ratings are in the description down below, but generally my rule of thumb here is that a safe rating means that it is a state that will go to either political party by a 15-point plus margin. Now, some of these states that I'm characterizing as safe were not safe back in the 2018 midterm elections. For instance, when you take a look at states such as South Dakota that were decided between 4 points between Christine Noem and Billy Sutton, states such as South Carolina with Henry McMaster defeating James Smith by a margin of 8 points statewide. These are states that now I feel more comfortable characterizing as solid red. They've definitely gotten increasingly more polarized as the years have progressed, and Democrats don't exactly fare a good shot in some of these races, even though they might have 4 years ago, especially considering that 2018 was a much better environment for the Democratic Party than where it stands today. Looking at some other states that we can characterize as safe red, we have 2 states that are typically swing states that we are very comfortable in this characterization, the states of Ohio and Iowa. Right now, Kim Reynolds in Iowa, pretty popular, on track to easily win re-election. Mike DeWine in Ohio, some people thought he might lose the primary there. There was a pretty strong, or technically speaking, a pretty strong Republican opponent to his primary, but he was still an incumbent, never really going to lose that race there. The state of Ohio didn't really face much opposition to Mike DeWine, and especially doesn't in the general election. I think the general election is going to be as easy for him as the primary was, which is honestly saying something, that it will be quite easy to win re-election. I think we can move it from what was a likely red characterization. Ohio is a state that does probably, narrow up in some elections. I think it very much will on the Senate level. But when it comes down to the governor election, Mike DeWine is again popular, similar to Kim Reynolds. It's also a Trump state, and it also is a state that has been very willing to elect Republicans by epic proportions in years past. In 2016, Rob Portman, the senator who is now choosing to retire, won by 21 points statewide on the same map that Donald Trump only won by 8. So very interesting things happen. Ohio, for right now, I'm comfortable characterizing as a safe red state. Moving up to the Northeast, we have 2 states that we can characterize as safe red, and they're not the ones that you might think, but they are the states of Vermont and New Hampshire. Now, if you knew that, kudos to you. That is a very good thing to know, because these 2 states have very popular Republican incumbents. Now, believe it or not, some of the most popular Republicans in the entire nation come from very blue states. Amongst the top 10 most popular governors, 4 of them come from the states of Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maryland. Stereotypical, very solid blue states, with the exception of New Hampshire, which is typically close, but voted for Biden by 8 points in the last election. Governor Chris Sununu, who was also up for re-election in 2020 on the same ballot that Biden was on, outperformed President Trump significantly, won by over 30 points statewide, despite President Biden only winning by about 8. And keep in mind that he was a Republican, so you have to go ahead and move it that way. So looking at Vermont and the state of New Hampshire, these are 2 states that Democrats simply aren't going to be competitive in. In fact, the state of Vermont was decided by 40 points. But I did mention Massachusetts and Maryland, in which there are 2 incumbents in that race. but won in those seats. In the state of Maryland right now, the governor is term limited. Larry Hogan, the Republican, also very popular, I think number 3 or number 4 nationwide. Charlie Baker, number 2 or number 3, depending on Larry Hogan's ranking, because it'll mean that there are probably 2 above them, I think Wyoming and another state. But the point is that in Maryland and Massachusetts, either one incumbent, Charlie Baker, chose not to run for re-election, not because he didn't think he could win, because he absolutely would have when he had every intention of running. The race characterizations were solid and safe Republican. But the thing is that he wouldn't make it through the primary. The Massachusetts GOP has already been attacking him. Donald Trump has been grilling him, and realistically, he wasn't going to make it through the first steps of the general election, even though he probably would have won in November. So Massachusetts is no longer a safe red state. I had it characterized as safe red when there was a very large expectation that he was going to run, but when that did not happen, it became immediately a blue state, and since then, it has remained a blue state, and will actually be the first state that I characterize as solid blue. So the state of Massachusetts, looking at it, again, I think it's going to flip. I don't think that this popularity for Charlie Baker is going to elect Jeff Deal, the Republican that is going to be nominated there. He's going to be on the ballot for the GOP. I just simply don't see it happening. It's not going to happen. And realistically speaking, it takes a special type of Republican, and none of those Republicans, or really in Massachusetts or Maryland, which we'll get to in just a moment, are going to be able to win in the general election. Dan Cox was nominated in the state of Maryland. That state is one where I think, the Democratic Party fares a good shot. This is a state that they typically win. They have Wes Moore as the incumbent. So looking at it, I would say definitively I think the Democratic Party is going to win there, especially knowing the partisan composition. These 2 states, again, are amongst the most Democratic in the nation. Let's make it quicker. Let's go through some of the remaining safe states. Illinois doesn't really, strike too many people as a competitive state. It could narrow down less than 15. I could believe the margin for J.B. Pritzker there could be 13 or 14, but realistically, I don't think that it will be. Taking a look at the state of New York, I would characterize it as safe blue. Looking at the states of Connecticut and Rhode Island, you might be surprised to say, why aren't they safe blue? Well, we'll talk about it. We'll get to that when we get to the likely states. Moving over to the next state, I'm going to characterize as safe blue, the state of California, the state of Hawaii. These are 2 states I think will join the bunch in terms of safe states for either political party, but that's it. The Democrats, with all of their safe states, only jump up to 12 seats. The Republicans, on the other hand, are already at 21. So it's a 21-12 advantage, but Democrats definitely are going to, gain ground with some of these likely states. If you look in the description box, it's between 5 and 15%, but I just wanted to say it in case you didn't want to look down. Sometimes I don't want to look in the description box, but just for future reference. Just looking at these remaining 17 states, you might be surprised to see some of them on the list, such as Kansas, Texas, Oregon, Rhode Island, but many of them are going to be decided by what we call likely margins. So we can go ahead and characterize those right now, but honestly, a lot of these are also still going to be decided by margins less than likely, meaning that they could go in either direction. We'll start off with the Democrats to see if they can gain ground on the GOP, see if they can make it up to 21 before we get into any of the likely Republican states. Honestly, I don't exactly know. Based off the top of my head, I know what these states are characterized because I characterized them ahead of the video, but I don't know so far if that's something that is going to happen. We'll see. Just give me a moment. So starting off in the states that I want to characterize as likely blue, we can go ahead and start on the western side of the United States in the state of Colorado. Jared Polis is very popular. I think that he is going to easily win re-election, but I don't think that he's going to win re-election by a margin than what Biden won back in the 2020 election. For reference, Biden won by 14 points statewide, and that's still a likely state. So I wouldn't imagine that Jared Polis in a year such as this one was going to outperform Biden. I do think he would outperform maybe some other statewide Democrats that might be running, such as Michael Bennet in the Senate race. But I don't think it's going to be, 16, 17 points. But it very well could if this was a better type of year or even a much more neutral year than what it is. The state of Minnesota, Tim Walz is doing pretty well. I would say that I would characterize it as a likely blue state. I have yet to see that the GOP has had some significant ability to win across the state. I think what we will find is that in November, Tim Walz will win re-election, and it was a race that probably the GOP should have funneled more money into. I think that it's one of the last states the GOP has on their target, on their radar, but it is going to be at least somewhat competitive. But I do think the Democratic Party will ultimately end up winning it. Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan is being helped out by the GOP so much. Tudor Dixon with her abortion comments, the Attorney General with his association of trying to, tamper with voting machines, and then also the abortion referendum that will be hitting the ballot that will definitely help the Democratic Party. I will say the state of Michigan right now, likely blue. Typically, I would never have characterized it as such. In fact, when you take a look at my prediction from November of 2021, you will find that that was not at all what I expected from the state of Michigan. I thought it was on track to become an even more solid red state, and you know what happened? It didn't happen. It ended up going to the Democratic Party now, and it looks like Gretchen Whitmer is on track for a pretty good victory this November. I think it could narrow down to lean, but I don't think that Tudor Dixon is going to win, at least as it stands, unless something dramatically changes between now and November. The next state I'm going to characterize as likely blue are the two states I talked about, actually the next two states, Connecticut and Rhode Island. These are two states where I think the Democratic Party will see a narrowing down of the race, but I don't necessarily think that it means that the Republican Party is going to win them. The Republicans have had some pretty substantial, close margins in these states in the past. When you take a look at 2018, let's take a look at the past elections. You look at the states of Connecticut and Rhode Island, and they were competitive. Connecticut was decided by 3, Rhode Island decided by 15, but you actually look back at 2014 and you find that Rhode Island was decided by a margin of about 5 points. Dan Malloy in Connecticut won by about 3 points. It's a very, very typical story that you see in these states. In 2010, Malloy won by less than a point. Rhode Island, Lincoln Chafee won by about 3 points. It is, again, a very standard story that you see, and sometimes these races are very, very competitive. So for right now, I would say, keep your eye out for these two states. They're not going to go to the GOP, but they definitely are going to narrow up. But that doesn't exactly mean that it's anything bad for the midterms. Connecticut was 3 points in 2018, and guess what? Joe Biden won the state by over 15 2 years later. So taking a look at this map thus far, these are all of the states I personally feel comfortable characterizing as likely blue states. I would go ahead and move on to some of the Republican states, but just really take in where these coalitions are coming from. The likely blue states are coming from Colorado, Minnesota, and Michigan. These are 3 swing states from the last election. Very interesting to see, and really a testament to what a popular incumbent can do, and also what very bad GOP candidates can do as well. So for right now, 17 Democratic seats. Democrats did not make up the margin, and there's quite a few likely Republican seats, and we'll get into that now. The state of Alaska, there's an incumbent Republican, but there is an independent governor who is now, a former governor who is now running to be essentially reelected or elected again. That's Governor Bill Walker. Now, once he actually gets through, there won't be any vote splitting between Democrats and the independent, largely because they have ranked choice voting now in the state of Alaska, so it might narrow up. But realistically, the GOP has a better national environment now than it was 2 years ago, or especially 4 years ago, and I think that will actually elevate them to victory in the state of Alaska. It didn't even go blue back in 2018, despite having a former senator and a very well-known name across the state. Ultimately, I think Alaska is still going to be pretty red. Looking at the state of Texas, I would characterize this as a likely red state as well. Texas is on track for victory for the GOP, and I would say that Greg Abbott is going to win that third term. The question is by how much, but he does end up winning it. I don't think it'll be lean. I think likely is a better characterization. You're talking 6 to 7 points, but it might change. Beto O'Rourke has definitely proven us otherwise, and polls aren't always the best indicator when Beto O'Rourke is on the ballot. Take a look at 2018. Moving over to the states of Georgia and Florida, you might be surprised to see 2 swing states as likely states, but that's because you have popular governors. Brian Kemp in the state of Georgia, Ron DeSantis in the state of Florida. These are 2 governors who are probably not going to lose re-election. I think Stacey Abrams probably should not have run this election cycle. She definitely is on track to lose as of right now versus Raphael Warnock, the Democrat in the Senate who is on track for victory. A lot of vote splitting, but largely because the Senate race, voters don't exactly seem too inclined to vote for Herschel Walker. But in the governor's race, they're all in for Brian Kemp. In Ron DeSantis' state of Florida, he is very popular there, has held on to that level of popularity ever since he took office. And realistically, Democrats don't fare much of a chance. I think Ron DeSantis is going to very much use this also too as a propelling point for his 2024 presidential bid that we may or may not see, depending on who decides to run, mostly President Trump. So the state of Florida for right now, I think Ron DeSantis wins by a margin 10, 11, 12 points statewide. If it's less than that, then maybe it's not exactly as good of a showing as we expected, but at the end of the day, it's a victory in a swing state that's beyond a lean characterization, meaning that Republicans ultimately ended up winning a significant portion of Democratic and independent votes this November. So Florida, Georgia, Texas, Alaska, these are states that are moving up the GOP to 25, meaning that they only need 1 out of the remaining 8 toss-up races to actually serve in these positions of being in the majority in the National Governors Association. It isn't some type of significant body, but it is important because it does have a chairman. It does sort of indicate which direction is going which, and I also think that looking at where we are thus far for Democrats and Republicans, if Democrats ever were to get the majority there, it would mean that they have done some significant work in some states that they typically don't win in, but ultimately the GOP does have the upper hand at this point. So in the remaining 8 toss-up races, we're going to characterize all of the lean states. Again, these are states between 1% and 5%, and we can start off on the East Coast. That way we can move our way into the West Coast. We have the state of Maine, in which Paul LePage, the former Republican governor, actually is now running to defeat the Democratic governor here. It's quite interesting, if you ask me, that a former governor is returning to try to run for public office. Now, this former governor has definitely had his own level of scandals and levels of popularity that have dwindled up and down, but for right now, I would say that Janet Mills is on track to be reelected. Maine itself is not inherently a red state. Donald Trump definitely did some numbers to the Democratic Party in the state, losing by only 3 in 2016, losing by only 9 in 2020. Obama won by larger margins in both 2008 and 2012. But ultimately, what I see is that the state of Maine right now is going to go to the Democrats by a lean margin, somewhere between 1% and 5%. It'll be close, but I still think Janet Mills will ultimately end up holding out. In the state of Pennsylvania, I think that Josh Shapiro, the Attorney General, is going to do pretty well. I think considering where we are nationally, it doesn't make sense that Pennsylvania, Michigan, Minnesota are blue states, but taking a look at it from a statewide level, it definitely makes a lot of sense. Josh Shapiro, in fact, on the 538 forecast has a very significant high chance at victory, about an 85% chance at victory. That's what happens when the GOP nominates someone who is as crazy as Doug Mastriano. Taking a look at some of the claims that he's been making, taking a look at some of the statements that he's had, I don't think that he is the electoral Republican there. And honestly, in my next prediction, I could be inclined to move it over into the likely Democratic column, but that depends a lot on where our national environment takes us in 2 weeks from now. The state of Wisconsin, we will have to get back to. It's not a state that can be characterized by lean. It's going to be narrower than that. Same thing in the state of Kansas as well. But the state of New Mexico is actually dropping a characterization from what was likely blue for quite some time all the way down to lean blue. Now, this lean blue characterization comes as a result of new data from out of the state. Also, specifically, Mark Ronchetti is a pretty strong candidate, knowing his 2020 Senate performance, losing by only 6. Biden won the state by over 10. He outperformed President Trump, and it's very likely that he outperforms Republicans on the national level yet again this cycle. I think Michelle Lewin Grisham, with her level of popularity, is holding steady, but I don't think it's enough to say that this state is likely blue like it once was, or at any point safe blue ahead of November. I think it'll be very competitive as we get into the final stretch of the campaign season. Very similar to the state of Kansas, how many people thought it would go to the GOP, but ultimately ended up going to the Democrats. That could very well happen in the state of New Mexico. And honestly speaking, I wouldn't be shocked, which is why it's in the lean column for right now. The next state I'm going to characterize as lean is actually the state of Arizona, in which it is moving up from the tilt Democratic column. Kari Lake, I think, is just simply an unelectable Republican. She is in a good position in terms of someone with her level of, issue-based policy. I think the statements that she has made and I think the political stances that she have are much more radical than you might think. But considering our national environment, it's such a good year for the GOP that it is very possible that she does end up winning. But I do think that Katie Hobbs, with, some of her flaws, is still going to be able to win this election here. If Doug Ducey, had the ability to run again, I think Doug Ducey would have easily won this governorship. But specifically in the state of Arizona for right now, what I think is going to happen is that Katie Hobbs is going to narrowly win, and Kari Lake is going to be upset about it. I think Kari Lake could very well win, though. I think depending on how, again, we head into November, it could go in a different direction. But for right now, I am comfortable characterizing Arizona as a lean blue state. Moving over to the state of Nevada, that is also going to be a state that is decided by a tilt characterization. But for the state of Oregon, we are going to keep it from where it was as a lean blue state. But we never really expected Oregon to be that competitive from the past. In fact, at one point, it was expected to be less competitive than California because of that recall election. That hype around it ultimately ended up being nothing. But for right now, Oregon is actually very much on track to be a very close and competitive state. Take a look at how it's characterized on 538. The Democrat here only has about a 71% chance of victory and is expected to win by at most 4 points statewide. So definitely something to keep your eye out for, especially if Democrats end up doing worse now than they were, worse in November than they are doing right now. So in the remaining 3 toss-up states, Republicans and Democrats are, 25 to 22. None of the states that I've characterized thus far have gone to the GOP in the lean column, which means any GOP victories will now remain in the tilt column. And that's what we're going to see happening. We'll start off on the West Coast this time because we started off with the lean states in the East Coast with the state of Nevada. And for right now, I would say the state of Nevada is a tilt Democratic state. In my last characterization, I had it as tilt blue. If you take a look at some of my other ones, I've really had it as a blue state. At different points, I did have the GOP winning it, largely because I thought that the national environment was going to move away from the Democratic Party and continue down that direction. But Steve Sisolak has proven that he's able to at least somewhat remain above water. I also think the Senate race is a lot more competitive and polarized and a lot more likely to go to the GOP than the governor's race. But right now, I think they're on a very similar level of narrowness when it comes down to the actual margin. I think Sisolak ends up winning, but I can't know if I am going to say the same about Cortez Masto. Definitely going to take a little bit more thinking. Moving over to the states of Kansas and Wisconsin, we'll start off with the state of Wisconsin, actually, just to shake things up a bit. I think that Tony Evers, despite all of the forecasters saying that he's going to win re-election, that he loses. Tim Michels, I do think, is a better candidate than Rebecca Kleefisch. Looking at the primary results, yes, he was the Trump-endorsed candidate, and that's something that might bock him down if it was a different type of year, but it's 2022. You also have a Senate race that Ron Johnson is likely going to win, and I don't know if there's going to be that much vote splitting. Typically in states such as Wisconsin, There isn't as much vote splitting as you might expect. Sometimes, in fact, the GOP has an overperformance. In the state of Georgia, though, I think that we've seen such consistent data indicating that there is a vote split. In Wisconsin, we've seen the same data show the Democrats up in both races. But we know in the Senate races, the Democrats probably aren't going to win there. So for the state of Wisconsin, I'd argue the same for the governorship. Not on that alone. I think there's a lot that goes into it. But for right now, I don't know if I agree with the characterization that Wisconsin is this likely Democratic state that Tony Evers has an 80% chance of victory. I think it'll narrow up. I think Wisconsin has definitely proven us wrong before in terms of the chances at victory. Take a look at 2016, for instance. And for right now, I would say the GOP narrowly pulls ahead in that state, especially considering that Tony Evers barely won in 2018, won by about a point in a blue wave year. And in the final state that I want to characterize, I am going to move the state of Kansas from what was a Republican characterization to a tilt Democratic one. Yes, this has a lot to do with the Kansas referendum, but it also has to do a lot with the approval rating of Laura Kelly. For the past, 5 to 10 polls that we've seen thus far in terms of the most popular governors across the nation, the most popular Democratic governors come from red states. Andy Beshear in Kentucky and Laura Kelly in Kansas. Her approval rating, according to some polls, is in the high 50s and low 60s. A very good approval rating. One that probably means she's probably going to win re-election. Considering the results from the abortion referendum too, it shows me that Kansas voters aren't exactly as pro-life or as conservative as otherwise might be thought. In addition to that, the Attorney General's race is going to be bogged down by Chris Kobach being back on the race as he was in 2018. He's someone that probably isn't going to do too well in the Attorney General's race. And for right now, the state of Kansas I would characterize as a tilt blue state, putting the Democratic Party at 24. The Republicans still win the majority of states, but it is narrowing up. The Democrats have come a long way from November 2021 when the map looked like it was on track to be 33-17. Today, in the most recent one, 27-23, and now today, 26-24. It'll be interesting to track over the next couple of months to see how they actually change between left and right. All of these lean and tilt states I definitely could be seen and could be believing in an argument that they could go in another direction. But for right now, I believe the Democratic Party will pull ahead in the states that I've characterized thus far, and Republicans will do as well. They still maintain the majority, but they lose overall. And I think a lot of it has to come down to who the GOP nominated, who they propositioned up, and what is actually happening in some of these races as well. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.